Been a full calendar year since I visited with Karin Callan, our City Finance Director, to talk about the fiscal status of the city, but that's what I'll be doing today. I'm City Manager Bill Osborne, and over the past few years I've enjoyed a late summer visit with our Finance Director so we could talk about what we saw as the revenue picture for the City of Douglasville and also the anticipated expenditures that we would be making during the upcoming year. Karin Callan, our Finance Director, welcome to this edition of On the Agenda.
Thank you, glad to be here.
And to our viewers, as you can see, we've got a different backdrop because today we're on the second floor of our new Public Safety and Municipal Court building. And so I hope you will enjoy us being with us today on the agenda. Now, before we make our annual report, as it were, I do want to commend you and your department, Karin. On, I think, July the 11th, the mayor received a letter from the Municipal Finance Officers Association saying that the City of Douglasville was being awarded the Certificate of Excellence for Financial Reporting, and that was for our comprehensive financial report for the year ended June 30th, 2010. Congratulations.
Thank
I think
you.
This is the
Thank
seventh
you.
year that y'all have actually been awarded this.
7th year in a row, yes.
That's great. I know there's a lot of hard work involved in that, and you can pass along best wishes to your staff for a job well done.
I will.
Now, Karin, we want to start our fiscal report this year by taking a look at the City of Douglasville and Douglas County, the tax digest as prepared by the County Board of Tax Assessors. And I'm sure that many people that are watching our program have seen their own property values decrease over the past 3 years. And of course, that has happened by what really is now being referred to as the Great Recession. And we have seen a lot of things happen over this past 3 years. One of the unfortunate side effects, of course, has been the large number of foreclosures that have occurred. And so not only have people lost value in their houses because of the market situation, but because of foreclosures in their neighborhood, they have seen the whole subdivision have somewhat of a depression in housing values. So that's actually, we have seen kind of a double-fisted assault on property values. And there are people who say that we're beginning to level off, to come out of the tailspin we've been in. Recovery, they say, will take a long time, but any recovery, of course, for the future will reflect property values in the future. And of course, we're dealing with the current tax digest, and that reflects the loss that there have been in property values in the here and now. And the 2011 tax digest in the City of Douglasville shows a gross tax digest of a little over $1.1 billion. And this, of course, is real and personal property, motor vehicles, mobile homes. The great majority of this, 96%, or $1.079 billion, is for real and personal property. And that actually is a decrease of more than $192 million in the gross digest from the previous fiscal year. And that's a large number, certainly. But even what we've sustained in the City of Douglasville in terms of the percentage drop in our digest is not as steep as what we've seen in the county overall. The County Board of Tax Assessors reports the 2011 gross tax digest for all of Douglas County had a combined value of more than $4 billion. This is a decrease, though, of $131 million, a drop of almost 3.2% from the previous year. So we have had some significant reductions that we've seen in our tax digest. Karin, go back for us, if you will, some 3 years ago to the point just before this economic downturn started, and what was our digest at that time, and how much of value has been lost?
From 2008 to 2009, we lost $100,000 in revenue. From 2009 to 2010, we lost $584,000 in revenue. And from 2010 to 2011, we lost $71,000 in revenue. So that's about $750,000 in lost revenue to the city for the past 3 years in property taxes.
Right. And I think those are significant figures. And of course, if we were looking on a county-wide basis, it would even be more than that. You know, in many cases, the Board of Assessors actually lowered real property values for the reasons that I had mentioned earlier. And we also had property owners who successfully appealed their valuations. But regardless of how it happened, the result was that the digest decreased, and with the digest decreasing, that meant the amount of revenue that we realized from property taxes went down. And of course, not just us, all local governments and school systems experience much the same thing. Now, because of this decrease in real property that is reflected in the dollar amount of the digest, we knew, the County Board of Commissioners knew, and the Board of Education knew several weeks ago that the property tax millage rate was going to generate less money. And let's just focus on the City of Douglasville for a minute, though the process I'm going to ask you to talk about in a minute would be applicable to all local governments and school systems in Georgia. But tell our viewers what the state law requires when you've got the change in your digest.
If you are to produce more revenues in the tax year that you are adopting the millage rate than the prior year, you have to advertise for a tax increase.
Right.
And if not, if you have increase in assessed property, if the value of your property goes up, that is not contributed to new construction within the city, then you have to roll back your millage rate so that your revenues equal the prior year revenues.
Right. If you intend to take an action that would actually bring in more revenue, you have to call that a tax increase.
Correct.
And where your digest actually goes down, then you have some flexibility there that you don't technically have to call that a tax increase.
Correct. You can raise your millage rate to collect equal amount of property taxes that you did the prior year, and it would not be considered a tax increase.
Right. And even though Mayor Thompson and members of the City Council could have increased the millage rate somewhat because what we have just talked about our digest decreasing, and they could have done that without it technically being called a tax increase, that's not what the city's elected officials decided to do, is it?
No, not at all.
So what did we do?
We kept our millage rate the same at 3.854.
Right.
So that if the value of your house went down, which is probably applicable to most people, then you will be paying less taxes. If the value of your house stayed the same, you will be paying the same amount of taxes as you did the prior year.
Right. And that 3.854 mills is something that we have actually, the council and the mayor have adopted for several years now.
That's correct.
Karin, I believe in the fall of 2010, we actually ended up receiving about $103,000 less in property tax revenue than our initial figures were calling for, and that's because there were appeals made to the Board of Tax Assessors, and then in some cases they did lower the assessment on people's properties, and so we did receive less than we thought we might because of that. But now I know that Georgia law requires us to publish the 5-year history. We did that recently. So if somebody had looked at that in the Sentinel, and we're going to show that on our screen, this is for maintenance and operations. If they look down at the bottom line on this, a lot of figures on that chart, but they will see just what we talked about of it remaining steady at 3.854 mills, which I think is certainly shows the mayor and council wanting to hold down the property taxes, and also I think reflects what we have done with our department directors in holding our budget in line over these times. Now, Before we leave talking about tax millage rates, let's talk for just a minute. There is a separate tax levy, of course, to retire the general obligation bonds that the city voters approved back in 2009 to build this wonderful building we're in today, the city's Public Safety and Municipal Court building. That not only is that a separate millage rate, it actually shows up separate on the tax bill. Tell us about that particular millage rate.
This is due to the bond referendum that was passed in 2009. The voters self-imposed a tax to build the public safety building. We issue bonds. This millage rate is used to pay the debt service every year, and the millage rate is set annually to pay the debt service payments every year. So as the debt service payment changes or the tax base changes, the millage rate will be adjusted so that it yields exactly the debt service payment.
Right, and I think that if you look, because of the decrease in the digest, because of that we've talked about before, the City Council did have to make a change in the tax millage rate to make the annual payment on the bonds for this year. What did we change on that millage rate, and what does that mean, say, for taxes levied on a house with a $100,000 value, an $80,000 value, for example?
Okay. So in the prior year, to make for this millage rate, for the bond millage rate, you would have had to pay $48.60 in taxes annually. For the current year, you would be paying $62 in taxes annually. So that's an increase of $13.40 annually for the debt service payment on the bond millage.
Okay. You know, when you look at what's happening in a lot of other local governments in the metro area, saw just earlier today the major increases in Clayton County and Cobb County. I think that our local governments here in Douglasville, Douglas County certainly have done a good job of holding the line. Now, let's put the tax digest and the tax millage rate aside, and let's talk about the budget.
Okay.
Now, from the 2011 levy on real property inside the city of Douglasville, you've projected that the city is going to receive almost $4 million, and while that's an extremely important part of our revenue picture, it's not the largest source of revenue for our general fund. For fiscal year 2011-12, that distinction goes, of course, to the sales tax, and you've projected revenues of $4,152,000 from that source. And kind of as an aside, before we go further, just point out that our fiscal year goes from July 1 to June 30th. So we're just beginning the fiscal year for 2011-2012, which was actually the council adopted that budget on June the 20th. Now, our two major revenue sources for years have been property taxes and sales taxes. And we've seen both of those drop significantly over the past 3 years because of what we've been talking about, decline in property values. And then I think most people recognize that the people haven't had money to buy things like they once did. And so we've seen our sales tax revenues shrink. And both of these, of course, due to the economic recession. Now, with these two revenue sources, let's talk a little bit about those. They account for 41% of our revenue for the general fund. Kind of break it out as to what the percentage is on each that goes into the general fund, and just kind of talk about that for a minute, if you would.
Okay. The way the general fund for the City of Douglasville's revenue sources are broken out are, as Bill said, sales tax is at 21% of our total revenue sources, property tax at 20%. Our other largest revenue source is our franchise fees, and that is from Georgia Power and Greystone Power, Bell South, all the different franchises we have within the city limits. Then we have alcohol beverage excise tax at 5%, occupational licenses at 7%, municipal court fines at 7%, and hotel motel tax at 2%, with other small revenue sources making up the other 19%.
Right. And you know, one of the things that we've had to deal with is that our sales tax revenues have gone down, 21% during the past 3 years. And property tax revenues have gone down 12%. So fortunately, we've had some other revenue sources have remained more stable. Now, if I look at the budget that we adopted recently, that's the general fund budget is $19,734,000, and we've got these various revenue sources that you've identified that account for about 60%, 59%, I think, while these two major sources account for the 41. We've talked about this in the past, that Douglasville is fortunate to have the diverse revenue sources. You know, one of the ones that we used to be able to count on, Karin, as being a pretty good size revenue source was permit fees on new construction.
Yes.
But of course, because the construction industry hit the brick wall with the economic recession, I think we budgeted this year only about $154,000 in permit fees for the whole year. Now, before we talk about the expenditure side of our general fund budget, when you look at that figure that I mentioned a minute ago of $19.7 million in the general fund, that's almost $2 million more than was in the general fund last year. And we've been talking about less revenues and everything. So how do we end up with about almost $2 million more in the general fund for this next year?
That increase is attributable to the debt service payment on the bonds. Almost $2 million of expenses going out and almost $2 million of expenses coming in for revenue on the bond payment.
Right. So, you know, in addition to the costs that we have on the debt payment on this building, we also have some other expenses that we're having to deal with in this year's budget because of the building. In fact, if you look at the added cost of operating this new public safety municipal court building, you know, we told all the departments you have to cut back 2.5% in your budget from last year. And 2.5% may not seem like a lot, but when you look at we'd been telling them to cut back in the past, and so whatever so-called fat they may have been in any of the budgets, we trimmed that out, of course, over the past 3 years, so we're still having to cut deeper. But that's the real world that local governments are having to face in this economic recession. And I know you and I told the departments cut back 2.5%. Now we had exceptions to that, and of course when you start making exceptions, somebody has to make up for the exceptions. And one of the things with this building we talked about, that they're in nicer space, bigger space, but you know, Chief Womack and his staff, I think, did a great job of quantifying the extra cost of simply being in this building, not just the added utilities, but various things in terms of operating cost, and that added up to almost $572,000. So we kind of exempted that $572,000 from the 2.5% cut. And then, of course, in the Parks and Recreation Department, Hunter Park had been closed for a good part of the previous fiscal year. But now we've got the new community center that's been operating, will operate for the full year. The renovated, reconstructed Hunter Park will be going full blast this fall. So, you know, we decided we couldn't even apply the 2.5% cut to the Parks and Recreation Department. So when you look at that, that meant that all the other departments had to deal with how do you cut back, including the police department with that part of its budget that was not exempted, that was not attributable to being here in this new building. So how did the departments deal with the 2.5% reduction that we told them had to be done?
Yes, it was definitely a tough budget year with revenue staying the same and operating expenses increasing due to the new buildings, the Hunter Park and the police building. We had to cut out capital. We had almost over $1 million worth of capital requests that this budget did not fund that we will be looking at later in the year.
Right.
There were some personnel reductions. And also we had to deal with increasing fuel prices. That was another challenge we had this year. But mostly we had to take all capital requests out of the current year's budget and decide how we're going to do that next year.
Right. And I will say, I think all of our departments did a great job of dealing with the fact that we're going to have to do some further cutbacks. And you know, for our employees, we've been pretty much at an employment freeze now for 3 years, and nobody's gotten any salary increases unless you got a promotion or your duties changed dramatically. But that's what we've done, and of course we also, in addition to, or as part of the capital projects you mentioned, included replacement vehicles. So we're having to get more miles out of all of our vehicles than we had in the past. Police department, we have told them that a lot of things that we once used to fund out of the general fund, they, over the last few years, with the confiscated assets fund that they have, the drug fund, they've been able to handle some of those items. But, you know, in addition to our general fund, we have some other funds, and I want to talk about the sanitation fund, which is, of course, very important to us. It funds our sanitation operation. So tell us about the sanitation fund.
The sanitation fund is one of our enterprise funds, and the revenues generated from our sanitation services can only be used to pay for expenses for the sanitation fund. So that is strictly, the money is strictly kept within that fund.
Right. And I think the budget that we have for the current fiscal year is a little over $3.6 million, which is only slightly higher than last year. Now, I know we started with the new fiscal year, July 1, by adding commercial sanitation. So how did that fit into the budget process?
On July 1st, the city took over the commercial sanitation services. We think that we're able to provide better service to the customers. This did not result in any rate increase, however.
Right. And of course, our sanitation services include our residential services, recycling, and the spring and fall cleanups. We have Keep Douglasville Beautiful, and then we also have some crews that are working to pick up trash on I-20, the interchanges, and on our streets to keep Douglasville being a more attractive place to live. Now, let's turn to hotel motel taxes, which are a big part of two of our other funds, and that's the Convention and Conference Center Fund and the CVB, the Convention and Visitors Bureau Fund. Karin, before I ask you to make some comments on these two funds, just point out the hotel motel tax basically is like a sales tax, and of course for our Convention and Visitors Bureau, that's 2 cents on the dollar. For our Convention and Conference Center Authority, that's now 3 cents on the dollar. And of course what we do with the CVB monies is to use that for promotion for our restaurants, for the lodging, for our business areas, commercial centers. And then of course we did have a 2 cent hotel motel tax for the conference center for a number of years. We started July 1, we added 1 more cent to that, and that is for downtown redevelopment purposes. And of course we're getting ready to build a new conference center downtown that has a 300 vehicle parking garage attached to it. And so that's where the 3 cent hotel motel tax for the Convention and Conference Center would go. But give us a brief report on the actual budget that we have this year for CVB.
The Convention and Visitors Bureau budget total is $336,088. It is a reduction of around $50,000 from the prior year, in which they have made up that reduction through reducing their marketing expenses.
Right. And of course, we have seen over the last few years, the whole thing we've talked about during this program, the economic downturn, certainly the public is traveling less or has traveled less. Hotel rates have been reduced in many cases. And so CVB has seen a decline in its income. Now, on the Convention and Conference Center with that fund, tell us about the budget for this year.
The total budget for that is $606,392. It's an increase of $151,339, and this is due to the additional 1% that we are allowed to collect this fiscal year.
Right. Plus the fact that I think we do have rental car taxes that come in on that, and of course we also have we rent space in the conference center, so we have the user fees on this, and that the new facilities that we mentioned, that will be a 37,000 square foot facility, and we believe that that's really going to make a big difference in the downtown area, the economy of downtown in the years ahead. I want to go back though on one thing we talked about on the hotel motel tax. You mentioned it when you were talking about our other revenue sources for the general fund, and we do have a 3-cent hotel motel tax for the general fund, and that we can use that however we wish. And when you add all of that together on the 8-cent hotel motel tax, we're expecting to generate $1.2 million during this current fiscal year. And we've covered a lot of ground during this program. Don't have time to talk about the budget we've got to develop on West Pines. We'll do that on another program. But I want to give you an opportunity for a final comment.
Glad to be here. Glad to be with the City of Douglasville. This mayor and council have done a wonderful job in pressing the departments and directors to do more with less. And we also have kept our millage rate at 3.854. We've lost over $700,000 in revenue. We have not decreased any of our services. It might not be as noticeable on your tax bill because it's embedded with the Board of Education and also the Douglas County Board of Commissioners. But just please realize that the City of Douglasville has kept their millage rate and lower taxes over the past couple of years. Right.
We have to depend on you to keep us straight in the fiscal area. Great to have you with us today. Great to have our viewers with us today for another edition of On the Agenda.